Can you all hear me? No, I'm going to continue where we left off. Now, the third Karmapa, Rangchung Dorje, his becoming a Shantong was earlier than Dolpa Shirab Jesam, and I've discussed the history for this. Now, when we look at the works of Karmapa Rangchung Dorje, did he write any that were written connected with the Shantong? He did. For example, his commentary on Nagarjuna's praise of the Dharma Dhatu, as well as commentary on the distinguishing phenomenon Dharmata, and his root text commentary on the profound inner meaning, and an outline of the sublime continuum. He wrote many such works that teach that instead of being an emptiness negation, they teach the view of Buddha nature. Likewise, he also said, Rangchung Dorje said that all those who want to enter the profound Vajrayana need to first understand the meaning of the words of the sublime continuum and his own profound inner principles. If they do not, then it'll be difficult for them to enter the profound Vajrayana and completely understand its profound and vast as mantra. So before you study the mantra, he said you should study those two texts. So this is his instruction, and so because of this, to this day, in the Kagyu lineage, we have a continuous lineage of teachings on the profound and meaning, the two books of Vajra and the sublime continuum. And so this is primarily because of the resolve and the intention of the third Karmapa Rangchung Dorje. So Rangchung Dorje is a Shantongpa, and Dolpa Shirab Gyaltsam is a Shantong. And so between the two of them, is there a distinction in their descriptions of the Shantong? So we would say that even if you're just merely saying they're talking about the Shantong, if we look at the works of Rangchung Dorje and those of his disciple, Shirab Rinchen, and if we compare these, then we'd have to say that Rangchung Dorje's Shantong is a bit different from Dolpopa's Shantong. Rangchung Dorje says that ultimately the Buddha nature transcends both extremes of existence of non-existence. He does not say that it is categorically truly existent. But Rangchung Dorje does identify that the ultimate is the wisdom, the perceiving wisdom. And therefore he is identifying the position of it existing more than the position of it not existing. And likewise, he also teaches that the thought of both Nagarjuna and Asanga are the same. He's talking about the Rangchung and the Shantong being the same. So later, within the many Shantongpas, many Shantongpas were not unhappy with the Rangtongpa. And it also said that the Rangtongpas are unhappy with the Shantong. And so we do see some such explanations. However, between the two of them, there's some scholars who say that the Rangtong and the Shentong are not contradictory. And among those, Rangjung Dorje was probably the earliest Tibetan scholar to say that the Rangtong and the Shentong are not contradictory. Kunchen Longchen Rangchem also explained that the Rangjung and the Shentong are not contradictory. So there's a connection of master-disciple between Rangjung Dorje and Longchenpa. So we can say that that there's an influence of Rangjung Dorje and Longchenpa, or because they could be said that there is. Now later, when we think about Mipham Rinpoche, I spoke about the Rangtong and the Shantongs being uncontradictory. And so he also considered Rangjung Dorje to be very important. So this is like in the influence of the. So there are scholars who are influenced by Rangjung Dorje's view that the Rangtong and the Shentong are not contradictory. Now, another important point that we need to consider, as we said that generally it's accepted that Janung, but it said that the Buddha nature is truly existent, isn't it? But when we talk about this, saying truly existent is whether it is the not lack of truly existent of the second turning the wheel of the Dharma, that's something we need to identify. When we talk about the mountain Dharma of Jonang, it says that it speaks of the truly existence means the truly existence of the third the third turning the wheel of Dharma. Now, in the middle turning the wheel of Dharma, Jonangpa says that so when you examine things, we cannot find anything true, and so therefore they are not said to be truly existence, but it's just merely not finding anything truly existence. And so when you talk about the self-existent, self-aware wisdom is not the lack of true existence taught in the middle turning. It's taught in this middle turning the wheel of Dharma. So when we say that the self-aware wisdom dwells in the Buddha nature, or that existence, or that it's unchanging from beginning of samsara till nine, that it is it abides in an unstained manner, and so for this reason, he makes a difference between truly existence and truly abiding. The Rangjung Dorje makes this difference. So in saying that, as when we talk about the Dolpelpame discussion, so when we talk about the truly existent, this means that it has been truly abiding from the very beginning and so forth. Now, the adventitious phenomena, the relative phenomena, sometimes they're present, sometimes they are not. So they're not certain. And they are changeable phenomena and deceiving phenomena. So therefore, there is this presentation of whether they're being truly existent or not being truly existent. Now, generally, when we talk about Rangjung Dorje, had studied and contemplated many the five sets of levels and many other mind-only texts, but he primarily emphasized the dharmas of Maitreya. This is basically the first Kagyu, either the general Kagyu or sublineage, to spread the teachings of the dharmas of Maitreya. So he left a very strong impression. He had a very great activity in spreading the teachings of the Maitreya. No, the Jonang master, Dolpo Shirab Gyaltsem himself, Dolpo Shirab Gyaltsem does not say that he is mind only. He wouldn't accept at all to say that he is not a mind only. Though he wouldn't accept that he is mind only, he would say that the texts of Maitreya and mind only, now these are generally accepted as mind only, but he would not have accepted it. But in terms of Buddhism in general, we call them mind only. These texts of Dharmas of Maitreya, and as also uses, and Dolpo Shirab Gyaltsem uses these texts as the main source for his view. So from one perspective, you can say that this had a great influence on the spread of these mind-only texts in Tibet. It had a great effect in propagating them in Tibet. But from another perspective, he himself didn't expect them that he was mind-only, but because he'd emphasized mind-only texts, there were also many who objected to him. To give an example of that, there's in the Blue Annals. What it says in the Blue Annals is that there are those who say that omniscient Joma Nangpa's position that Buddha nature is permanent is mistaken. But there are many in U and Sang who take the sublime continuum as the Yidam. This is just because of the kindness of the Kuntian Doppelshirab Jatsen. So there are many people who consider the sublime continuum to be very important, and many teach and study it, right? And the reason is because of the kindness of Doppelshirab Jatsen. So it's like a praise of him. But Gorampa writes to him, the name mind only has been changed to Shentong. So they've changed the name mind only into the change Shentong, given it this new name. Other than that, it's a mind. It's actually mind only. But what they call themselves is the great middle way. That's what the Jonapa says. So this is like he is like displeased by it. So there are many other such scholars. So now, in terms of the entire Buddhist school, these texts that are well known as to be mind-only texts were not explained by Dopa Chalcim to be mind-only texts. What other people said were mind-only texts, he did not accept as mind-only texts. What he says in his Mountain Dharma, the Ocean of Definitive Meaning, says that all the works, including the sutras of the third wheel of Dharma, all five of the mantras and the compendium about Abhidharma, the five sets of levels, and Vasubandu's 30 verses and so forth, are not mind-only. He went through each of them, said they're not mind-only, and he said that not only not only are they not middle way, they're not mind-only, they're not the Rangtong middle way, they're Shentong middle way. And he proved this with many quotations and legos. Now, he wrote many letters to disciples, and what it says in these letters is that it's definitely not true that the third wheel of Dharma was known as mind-only. It's known that way, but it's definitely not true. There are people who say that the five dharmas of Maitreya are mind-only texts, but some of them, and some people say that they're a mixture of mind-only middle way. But he said that's not true. All five dharmas of Maitreya are definitely great middle way texts. And sutras, including the Vatamsaka and the Parinirvana Sutras, are said to be sutras that teach the mind only. They're the sutras that give the source for the mind only. And he says these are not mind only sutras; these are definitely middle way, Shentong middle way sutras. Similarly, Asanga and Vasubandu, Vasubandu, Dagnag, and other one else who's known as generally known as a mind-only Pandita is definitely a middle way Pandita. They also said that they commented on the Prajnaparamita Sutras as mind only, but this is also definitely not true in actuality. So he said things somebody decisively said many things that if we look at these situations in brief, then in the Jonam tradition, the tradition of Dobos Shedra Jalsen, there's no clear identification of what texts are mind only or who mind only scholars are. Or even if it is explained, they're just like one or two mind only scholars, or maybe one or two mind only texts. The ones that all of the scholars are recognized internationally to be mind only, and all the texts that they wrote that are recognized internationally to be mind only, he said that none of them are mind only. And that's another important thing that we should know. Now, among all the Jonang scholars who followed Dolpopa, the most well known is Jonang Jetsun Tadanata. Jonata was very different than other Tibetan scholars. He had a very broad knowledge of history. He wrote a history of India called The History of Buddhism in India, which many contemporary scholars use as a source when they're researching Indian history. So he had a very broad knowledge of history. And when he was examining things, he was able to do this in a fair and impartial way. If we look at the way he explains things and the way that Dolpopa explains things, I think perhaps a little bit different. Now, what Taranata says is that when Bhavak Vivek and others say that Asanga is mind only, they criticize him for it. And if you look at the way they criticize him, then this should say that it's saying that generally they're saying that mind only was thought to be mind only. But what it says in Taranata's Taranata does not use the term mind only for Asanga and as follows. He uses the word awareness, proponents of awareness, where he talks about the middle way proponents of awareness. So if you look at the way he uses his terms and designations, it's not always very clear. Now, in terms of the view, Taranata describes Diganata, Sthiramati, Dharmapala, Chandragoma, Vinita Deva, and Asvabhava as if they were mind only. It seems that, and so if we look at how he speaks it seems that so even though Dolpopa views that that Asanga and Vasubandu and so forth were not known as mind only even in India, but it seems that Taranata says that the Asanga and Vasubandu and so forth were commonly known as mind only. But I believe he must have thought deep down that they are Shentong Great Middle Way. But this is another thing that needs to be examined. So next, when speaking about the Shentong view, after Dolpopa, Sherab Gyaltsen, there was the Panchen Shakya Chokten who had a different explanation. So you could say it's the most different explanation. Now, Panchen Shakya Chokten was well known as a Sakya scholar, and among the Sakya scholar, they talk about there being the three most learned scholars of Sutra and Tantra, and they have this, and so he's said to be one of these three. Also, Panchen Shakya Chokten also had a deep relation or connection with the seventh Karmapa and the fourth Shamapa and others. And Shakya Chokten also had a greater influence on the Kajun, Jonang, and other lineages besides the Sagyaba. Now, in the first part of his life, Panchen Shakya Chokten was a Rangtong, but in the latter part of his life, he became Shentong. And what he said is that there are two different types of the middle way: the Yogacara middle way and the middle way proponents of essencelessness. The Yogacara middle way, if you divide them, you can say that they're the Rangtong and the Shentong. The proponents of essencelessness have two different points. They can be divided into the consequentialist and the autonomist schools. And so it's a different way of classifying them. Now, what he gives as an example of the Yogacara middle way, the example he gives for the Rangtong Yogacara middle way are the Shantarakshita and his disciples and descendants. And the example he gives of the Shentong Yogacara middle way are Asanga and his disciples. So generally, when we look at the Yogacara middle way, we do speak about this. We do speak about the Yogacara middle way, but this explanation of a Rangtong and Shentong Yogacara middle way is probably Shakya Chokden's own particular explanation. And another very complicated thing in his use of in his terminology is that mind only is can be understood as the mind only of the five schools. But when you talk about the proponents of awareness in the Yogacara, that's not necessarily only mind only. Because with the proponents of awareness, the Vigyaptavada, they're both mind only and middle way parts, as I said before. As I mentioned before, with the Yogacara middle way, he talks about there being both Shentong and middle way. And he also said that with the proponents of awareness of Vigyaptivada, there are both middle way and mind only passages. And generally, it is also said that in the mind only, there are two sub-schools, the true image and the false image school. Please wait a moment. So generally, we say that there are the distinction between the true image and the false image schools. But what Shakya Chokten says is that the meaning of the true image school and the five image school are present, of course, in the mind-only texts from India, but the term did not occur at all in India, he says. And another important thing that he said, when you talk about the people whose the false image school whose name and meaning are the most important, these are the Yogacara middle way. So we talk about the false image school whose name and meaning really fit best is the Yogacara middle way Shentong school. Now, another thing that he says is that between the mind only and the middle way, or between the mind only and the Yogacara middle way Shentong, the difference between these is that, as he describes it, is the difference is the mind only asserts that consciousness is ultimate truth, and the Yogacara middle way, the Shentong, asserts that consciousness is not ultimate, but only discriminating self-aware wisdom is ultimate. So this is the difference between middle way and the Yogacara middle way. Likewise, in the mind-only tradition, wisdom is also said to be consciousness, but in the Yogacara middle way, you have to distinguish between wisdom and consciousness. Wisdom is not consciousness, he says. Likewise, in the mind training, there's the dependent nature does not exist, but he says that according to the Yogacara middle way, it is not, and this is and so he says the ornament of the sutra says that the dependent is illusory and that's not truly existent. He says. Now, another difference between his explanation and Doboshet of Jiaozin's is that I need to restart it or else it'll not work right. Now, another different explanation between Paisha Shokten and Doboshet of Jiaozin is that Doboshet is and Doboshet said, is it so Shakya Chokten accepts that Shakya Chokten and Bhaviveka, the Chandrakirta and Bhaviveka said that they are Now, there are many aspects in the teaching of what Shakyamuni says is there are many aspects of the mind only that are similar to the middle way, but that is not. Excuse me. Dolpopa said that the middle way acharyas did not call Asanga and Vasubandhu middle way and refute them, but Shakya Chokten said that when Baba Vivek and Chattakya did rebut Asanga's founders. But this is not referring the Yogacara middle way thought, but the many explanations of the mind only they found in Asanga disciples' works. And so when if you say Baba Viveka and Chattakya and say that Asanga disciples are not middle way, but if that's all you need to say that they are not middle way, then when Asanga and his disciples explain that the proponents of essenceless fall into nihilist extreme, then the same concept will apply to them. But just because they're not called, said to be extremist, be a nihilist by Asanga, that doesn't necessarily mean so. And likewise, Chandra Viveka says that Bhava Viveka is the same as a realist, then all autonomists would consequently be a realist, but that is not logical to say that. So when Chandra Katita says that Asanga didn't realize the thought of Nagarjuna and therefore was not a middle way, then that doesn't necessarily mean that he necessarily was not middle way. Now, also if we look at the way there are many different ways that Shakya Chokten's ways are explained. And so there are many refutations of Pancha Shakya Chokten's words among Gelugpa school and the 8th Karmapa Georgia and so forth. In any case, there's we're saying for the falsage of the mind only, and the distinguishing the mind only, the proponents of awareness, and is basically this is the Shakya Chokten's explanation of this is a very particular explanation. So this is another thing that we need to understand when we're researching this. Even among Shentong masters, there are different ways of explaining and different ways of explaining their thought. And this is another thing that is important for us to research. So in brief, to give a summary about the relations between the mind, or the connection between the mind only and the Shentong. The mind only school did not actually spread to Tibet. There was no autonomous school or lineage of the mind only in Tibet. But if we look at it in terms of the facts, the sources the Shentong rely on are exactly the same as the mind only texts. So the sources of the mind only and the sources of the Shentong and whether the sutras or the tantras are exactly the same. So for this reason, the mind only view and the Shentong view are extremely close. They're very they're really closely related. I think you can say this. But of course, the Shentongpas, I'm not saying that Shentongpas are mind only. I'm saying that there's a relation between them. However, and the reason they're close is because the sources the sutras and treatises are exactly the same. And so in such a situation, still the Shentongpas do not accept at all that they are mind only. They won't accept this idea at all. And not only that, they really don't like the mind only. They kind of keep the distance from them. They keep their distance from them and don't like them. And what is the reason for that? Now, my opinion, I have some opinions about that. I've written them here. Whether they're actually so or not, but this is how I'm going to explain it. Well, that's ordinary individuals. When you give our opinions, some of them are true and some of them are not. There are various things that happen. So what is the first reason? First, in Tibet, it's thought that if you're a Mahayana school, then you must be either mind only or middle way. So that's the way it's thought in Tibet. You have to be one or the other. Now, it's not necessarily so. Generally, there are those that have the other. There's some people say you don't necessarily have to be either mind only, middle way, and some say that it must be either mind only, middle way. But if you're going to choose between mind only and middle way, who are you going to choose? You're going to choose the middle way because that's accepted to be the highest, most final view. And so, no, if you say that the middle way is the final view, then no one's going to choose the one that's not the final, ultimate view. Likewise, but during the period of the later tradition, the middle way is incredibly influential. And particularly, the consequential schools were incredibly influential. So no one was able to let go of the idea of that they themselves were also middle way. Forget about anything else. So Shantarakshana disciples didn't call themselves consequentialists, they were autonomous. So later, they're also promoted to being consequentialists. And so because everyone, no one wanted to be called Mando, so everyone had to say that they were called middle way. So everyone would call themselves great middle way. Now, of course, there's great middle way. There's no lesser middle way, but everyone had to say that they were middle way. And that's the situation. It's because of a social situation. If you talk about what's the ultimate view, but the pinnacle of the view is the king of thought. And if you don't keep that, then you can't sort of hold yourself in front among all the different ledgers. This is sort of a social situation. That's one point. Now, the second point is no mind-only scholars came to bed. I think I said that they didn't come. If maybe one or two came, then a famous mind-only scholar no famous or influential mind-only scholar came. And if you think about like China, there was someone like Tang Xinsuan who went to India to study the mind-only view. He went to India to study the mind-only, and he brought it back to China. But this didn't happen in Tibet. There was no one in Tibet who went down to study the mind-only, to India to study mind-only, came back to Tibet. There wasn't anyone like that. And if you're going to have somebody who says this, you have to distinguish what are the mind-only texts. But that was never clearly distinguished. What are the mind-only texts? There's no clear view, the distinction of the view and the text of the mind-only. Now, the mind-only texts, such as the Dharma and Maitreya, these are like, they're later texts. And so because they're later texts, there's like they're giving little bits of text, but there's like they were earlier texts, and so they didn't give any clear and succinct presentation of the complete mind-only view, the complete and full view that after they become an independent school, they aren't giving any sort of clear and succinct view of the mind only. So for this reason, the dharmas of Maitreya can be stretched in any which way, like a ghost, and be pulled up and pulled down. Because if you look at the words, there's some mind-only words, but there's some middle way terms, but there are also some mind-only words, and there's no clear teaching that it's necessarily mind-only, and so you can call them whatever you want. That's another point. So I think that's another reason. Now, a third reason is that in China and among contemporary researchers these days, what researchers say is the mind only itself. Even within the mind, there is a strong affinity for Buddha nature school. Actually, between the mind only and the Buddha nature school, this is something I'll speak about that tomorrow. I'm not going to say too much more, but basically, international researchers these say that if we look at the ancient Indian way of describing it, if we talk about there's the mind only, they had a great there was great influence on the mind only school. Had a great influence on the mind only because they appeared before the mind only. Likewise, also many of the scholars, such as Thirumatada, also had a strong relation or connection to the Buddha nature school. Because, as I mentioned the other day, the translation of the Sublime Continuum into Chinese, in that translation, it said it was written by Thirumatada. And so for these reasons, was just conducted as the founder of the Buddha Nature School, or as a great scholar of the Buddha Nature School, as many later researchers explain. In any case, there's a very close connection between the mind only and the Buddha Nature School. It's extremely deep connection, and so for this reason, if we don't really understand the mind only tradition completely, and we don't really understand the Buddha Nature School entirely, then it's really easy to mistake them for each other because there's so many similarities. Sometimes in Chinese, sometimes many people mistake some scholars saying, "Oh, this is a mind-only scholar," when they're actually a Buddha Nature School and so forth. And the reason for this is that in terms of the view, historically, there's a great connection between them and the view. They're very closely related, and they took each other as examples, and they learned from each other. They studied each other's texts. And so for this reason, so there had to be a connection. There are so many similarities between them. There are so many similarities. Of course, it's possible there are dissimilarities, but there's so many similarities that if you didn't understand his own school completely fully, you might say that you're mind only, but think this is a mind only position. But in actuality, it is actually a position of the Buddha Nature School. You might think that you're a Buddha to the mind school, but actually you're making a mind only position. There are many such situations. So for these three reasons, I think that the Tibetan middle way Shandong school, how do we say this? These are three reasons why the Tibetan Shandong school is unable to accept themselves as being close to the mind only, why they are kind of averse to the mind only. However, if the Shandong Buddhists were not so insistent on being instant, if they would insist that I'm a middle way, and instead if they think to themselves that they were Buddha Nature School, if they said that they're a separate Mahayana school, if they accepted that they were a third type of Mahayana school, then I think it would be a bit of a different situation. And the reason for this is in China, there was this Buddha Nature School. It was in China, and the international researchers from the very beginning. At the beginning, they accepted our traditional, and they said that the Mahayana was definitely the two schools, the mind-only middle way. They said this, but later when they continued the research, they saw that actually you can't say that there are only two schools within the Mahayana. There had to be a third school in the Mahayana. And the proof for this, and the source for saying that there is this, and the most important evidence is the sublime continuum. And this is sublime Indianism. We say from the beginning that of course it's there, we've already had it for a long time, we said, but it's not that. They found they found a Sanskrit manuscript of it, and when they researched the manuscript, the sublime continuum is a little bit different from the mind only. It's a little bit different from the mind only. It's a little different from the middle way and different from the mind only. And so for this reason, it is Mahayana. And so it must be a separate Mahayana school. And so there's one way of explaining it that began to develop and became clearer and clearer. So when I think about this, I think this is pretty good. This idea that there is a Mahayana, there's a Mahayana Buddha Nature School, I think that's good. Usually, actually, as I said the other day, the Buddha, it's like I said, we often say that there are only four Buddhist schools, and we use this, but I think Buddha is saying that in some ways, we could just say that there's a third Mahayana school, since there's no reason to start a third school. But actually, in India, like in India, there's a lot of freedom in the schools. Like The fundamental school, there are 18 different schools. And so and so there's no reason in the Mahayana why we couldn't have two or three schools. And so for these reasons, if we accepted that there's a Buddha nature school, I think there wouldn't be any problem with that. We wouldn't need to have so much debate between the Rangtong and the Shentong. We'd have to insist on being middle way and try to see, can we fit ourselves into the mind only and insist be so sensitive. If we just say that we're the Buddha nature school, that's separate. And so I'll speak about this at more length later when I teach on the Sublime Continuum. So in brief, the Shentong view spread very widely in the Jonang, but it also spread very widely in the Sakya. There's Sakya Shentong proponents, and there are proponents of Shentong in the Kagyu. They're proponents of the Nyingpa. There are many Kagyu Nyingpa scholars who take the Shentong view. Among the Geluk school, later there was Jakar, who did write some text supporting the Shentong view. And he has some very good texts on this. No, I'm not going to necessarily, I can't say that I can clearly identify him as being a Shentong master, but if we look at this, a Shentong view is there is within the four Tibetan traditions, we talk about the four. If you add the Jonam, that's the five Tibetan traditions, and the Shentong view spread widely among all this. And if you think of it as very beneficial, if you think about Dopa, if you talk about Dopa Jason, but did this to bring any benefit for the mind-only school to actually benefit and spread Tibet? It didn't. Because teaching the same text, teaching the sources, it should benefit the mind-only school, but it didn't actually benefit any mind-only school. But what it was beneficial for was in terms of spreading the mind-only text, the works of the Dharmas of Maitreya, the texts of Asanga and Vasubandu, and so forth. And so this is the reason why we have to talk about the connection between the mind-only and the Shentong. And there's a strange connection because it's not okay to say that Shentong is the mind only because they say that they're not mind only, and their way they explain it is slightly different than the mind only. However, but when you look at the text that are the sources, they use exactly the same sources in terms of the sutras and the treatises. This is really pretty amazing, isn't it? I think this is probably only in Tibet, nowhere else. And so for these reasons, the connection between the Shentong and the mind only is very important. So I made a separate topic for this. Now, I need to give some sort of a summary of this, or I'll never get to anything else. So what I'll speak about tomorrow is the influence that the mind only had in Tibet, not only in terms of view, but in terms of conduct and meditation. Likewise, in Tibet, we talk about the four main traditions in Tibet. How the five dharmas of Maitreya and other such texts were influential and so forth. And I will continue, as I mentioned the other day. And to talk about texts, I'll speak about it. I'll speak about the relations as according to how we describe it in contemporary research, the relations between the mind only and the Buddha nature school, and the relations between the mind only and the middle way school. Okay, so that's enough for now.